What if I told you that America's most prolific serial killers weren't outlaws with guns, but a family of devout Christians who poisoned over 800 pioneers on the Oregon Trail and hid it behind the cross in the remote hills of eastern Oregon? Hidden beneath layers of official silence and forgotten tombstones lies a story so savage, so incomprehensible, that it has been erased from most American history books. Between 1852 and 1888, along a lonely 20-mile stretch of the Oregon Trail, entire families vanished not because of cholera, not because of accidents or hostile raids, but because they stumbled into the sacred doors of a modest wooden chapel that promised salvation. Instead, it delivered America's darkest history, written in the names of the Oregon Trail murders, a true crime saga that redefines evil itself. The Grayson family, led by a towering, silver-eyed preacher named Father Murray, his gentle wife, Sister Constance, and the watchful brother Ezekiel, built the Sacred Heart Chapel as a beacon of hope for dying pioneers. But behind its weathered wooden walls, they orchestrated one of the most methodical, cold-blooded murder operations in the entire Wild West, transforming faith into a weapon and prayer into a deadly snare. This wasn't just murder. This was murder perfected into a business model. They kept meticulous records, calculated every victim's worth, and buried hundreds of innocent souls beneath the Oregon pines, while the rest of the country praised the bravery of westward expansion. This is the side of the American frontier you were never meant to see: a hidden history dripping with arsenic, betrayal, and the smiling face of Christian compassion. If you think you're ready for the rawest truth buried under the romantic legends of pioneers and wagon trains, hit that like button and subscribe for more true crime, serial killers of the Old West, and the secrets America tried to bury. Tell me in the comments, would you have survived the Grayson family's so-called mercy? Because tonight, we're going back to 1852, where salvation came wrapped in a preacher's cloak, and death tasted like a cup of herbal tea. Imagine driving west through Oregon's quiet hills, your GPS out of signal, and realizing the very ground beneath your tires once drank the blood of America's largest unknown serial massacre, and no one ever told you. For over a century, the rolling hills east of the Blue Mountains have whispered secrets that never reached the pages of American history books. In school, we're taught of brave pioneers carving a path through 2,000 miles of wilderness, facing storms, disease, and starvation on the fabled Oregon Trail. But what if I told you that for a 20-mile stretch of that trail, the real killer wore the robes of a missionary and smiled as he offered salvation? This is not just a piece of dark history. This is one of America's hidden atrocities. A true crime story so staggering it makes the legends of Western outlaws look like campfire tales. Between 1852 and 1888, more than 800 men, women, and children vanished without a trace along a rugged corridor in eastern Oregon. That's not a typo. 800 souls, lost in the shadows of pine forests and under the guise of religious mercy. These weren't victims of cholera, wagon accidents, or raids. They were victims of a family who turned murder into a ritual, and religion into their perfect camouflage. Welcome to the Oregon Trail Murders, a chapter of America's darkest history that few dare speak aloud. The Oregon Trail was meant to be a road to freedom, prosperity, and hope, stretching from Missouri to the fertile valleys of the Pacific Northwest. But out here, hope became a commodity, and people paid for it with their lives. And at the heart of this silent slaughter stood a modest wooden chapel known as Sacred Heart. It perched on a hill like a guardian angel, overlooking weary travelers desperate for rest, medical care, and perhaps the comfort of a Christian burial for their dead. Yet behind its timbered walls, it concealed the Grayson family, America's most lethal and methodical killers you've never heard of. Father Murray, Sister Constance, and Brother Ezekiel didn't just kill. They kept ledgers like accountants of death, logging every life stolen, every piece of gold pocketed, every family erased. It's a tale that blends true crime with the chilling echoes of cult fanaticism, perfect for a world where we devour stories of serial killers and secret societies. But this is no Netflix fiction. This horror happened on American soil, hidden beneath the romantic glow of wagons and pioneers. The deeper you look, the more you'll realize how terrifyingly easy it was for predators to cloak themselves in Christian compassion while orchestrating a systematic slaughter. If you think your faith in humanity can handle the truth, stay with me. Because this is the forgotten nightmare that lurked behind wagon wheels and wooden crosses, a nightmare that left hundreds buried in unmarked graves beneath Oregon's quiet pines. While the rest of the nation moved on, none the wiser. Hit like, subscribe for more real crime and serial killers of the Wild West. And tell me in the comments, do you still believe salvation always wears white robes? They say the Oregon Trail claimed thousands of lives through disease, starvation, and deadly terrain. But for 20 blood-soaked miles in eastern Oregon, the deadliest danger wasn't dysentery. It was the cross. Along that cursed stretch, between 1852 and 1888, the trail morphed from a symbol of American hope into a corridor of invisible graves. Here, over 800 pioneers vanished into thin air, leaving behind empty wagons, abandoned oxen, and questions that would haunt generations. No one thought to suspect a small wooden chapel standing lonely on a windswept hill, a place that promised salvation and delivered death. This wasn't just another Western horror story. This was a meticulously calculated business of murder disguised as divine charity. A hidden chapter of America's dark history that redefines the meaning of the word evil. The Oregon Trail was America's ultimate highway to dreams. From Independence, Missouri, families sold everything they owned for a shot at new beginnings in the Pacific Northwest. They endured heat, blizzards, swollen rivers, and disease. By the time they reached the rugged hills east of the Blue Mountains, they'd already survived nearly 1,800 miles of brutal travel. Many were sick, exhausted, and dangerously low on supplies. Their faith and their bodies were stretched to the breaking point. And that's exactly where Father Morai Grayson was waiting. He didn't need a gun to kill. He used the Bible. And he wielded salvation like a blade. Travelers described him as tall, gaunt, with piercing gray eyes that seemed to see straight into your soul. His sermons dripped with eloquence. He knew scripture backward and forward. And beside him stood his gentle wife, Sister Constance, whose soft voice and healing hands seemed heaven-sent to grieving mothers and sick children. She carried herself like a nun, spoke like a saint, and hid a heart as black as midnight. Completing the facade was Brother Ezekiel, Morai's younger brother, a man who could mend a broken axle, calm, skittish oxen, and appear miraculously when help was most needed. Together, they were the perfect predators, a wolf pack cloaked in Christian charity. Their trap was almost foolproof. The Sacred Heart Chapel perched atop a hill, perfectly placed near a natural resting point on the trail. Weary travelers saw it as a gift from God, a place to rest, seek prayer, and bury the dead with Christian rites. Its rough-hewn pews, wooden cross, and simple altar painted an image of rustic holiness. The Graysons offered shelter, medical help, and spiritual guidance free of charge. Because nothing draws desperate people like the promise of grace. But behind every hymn, there was a ledger. Behind every prayer, there was poison. By the time a family rolled into the Graysons' deadly embrace, they were easy prey. Morai would gently probe them about their journey, their health, their denomination. He was a master at tailoring his sermons to match your faith. Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian. It didn't matter. He would quote scripture in whatever cadence soothed your fears. Meanwhile, Sister Constance assessed who was sick and who might be vulnerable to her healing tonics. And Ezekiel. He watched the wagons. He calculated the gold, the heirlooms, the tools worth stealing. To the Graysons, every traveler was inventory. Every soul had a price tag. Some pioneers suspected nothing, even as loved ones fell mysteriously ill. Others felt an unease they couldn't explain. But the Graysons were experts in deflection. Morai would murmur soft reassurances. God tests his children hardest when their blessings are near. And Constance would say, sometimes, the Lord purges the body to save the soul. Those words weren't comfort. They were death sentences. People assumed the frontier was savage because of Indians, outlaws, and wild animals. But the Graysons proved the most terrifying predator was the one who smiled, held your hand, and prayed over your dying child. That's why this story deserves to be told. Because America's dark history isn't just about gunfights and saloons. It's about predators who understood that faith could be the sharpest weapon of all. It's about how, for 36 bloody years, the Graysons turned the Oregon Trail into a conveyor belt of death, and no one stopped them. If this is your first time hearing the truth behind the Oregon Trail murders, hit like, subscribe for more true crime, hidden history, and the chilling secrets America tried to bury, and drop a comment below. Would you have recognized evil behind those holy eyes? Because the Sacred Heart Chapel wasn't a church, it was America's deadliest slaughterhouse. On the Oregon Trail, most travelers feared cholera, but they should have feared the man who offered them a bed to sleep, a prayer to whisper, and a poison that tasted like salvation. For many pioneers crossing America's wild frontier, the ultimate test wasn't the roaring rivers or the barren deserts. It was the silent danger waiting in the green hills of eastern Oregon, a place where death wore a preacher's smile and called itself grace. The Graysons understood something that changed the rules of survival on the trail forever. They realized that the most effective predator didn't stalk its prey in darkness. It welcomed them in daylight, with open arms, speaking the language of hope. By the time the exhausted wagon trains arrived near the Sacred Heart Chapel, families were shadows of themselves. Their clothes hung loose on bone-thin bodies. Their oxen stumbled under the weight of wagons carrying not only possessions, but graves of those who'd already fallen to the rigors of the trail. These pioneers were desperate, vulnerable, and above all willing to believe that God might have placed a holy refuge in their path. Father Morai Grayson, towering and gaunt, would step out into the dusty light, his gray eyes reflecting the agony he claimed to soothe. Brothers and sisters, he'd proclaim, the Lord has led you here so that his servants might ease your suffering. His voice was balm, his words were a net, and beside him, Sister Constance would press cool cloths to fevered brows, offering herbal teas steeped with invisible death. But it wasn't just random charity. Every family was a calculation. Every handshake was an appraisal. The Graysons measured not only the size of your wagon, but the sorrow in your eyes. The more exhausted you were, the easier it was to convince you that your child's stomach pain was trail sickness and not arsenic eating away at their organs. The trail takes what it wants, Morai would say solemnly. But here, you are in the Lord's hands. Those words lulled people into fatal complacency. Because on the Oregon Trail, death was such a constant companion that even murder could hide in plain sight. The Graysons' genius was understanding this universal truth. People needed to believe there was purpose in their suffering. That belief let Morai bury victims under Christian hymns and polite sorrow. A family could die, one by one, and no one raised a question. Because to question the Graysons was to question God himself. As Morai preached from the humble wooden pulpit, Sister Constance worked quietly, preparing mixtures she claimed would purify the blood and drive out the poisons of the trail. Meanwhile, Brother Ezekiel wandered among the wagons, helping repair broken wheels, calming panicked oxen, and more importantly, cataloging everything worth stealing. He noticed the shimmer of gold rings hidden under sleeves, the glint of silver tucked into luggage. To the Graysons, each soul was a future prophet, each corpse an opportunity. It was a perfect crime scene because the Oregon Trail was a place where people vanished every day. Families might leave Missouri together, but by the time they reached Oregon, half were gone, lost to disease, river crossings, accidents. Who would question another family fading into the silence of the wilderness? And the Graysons played that silence like a symphony. Sometimes, the Lord calls families home together. Sister Constance would whisper over a dying child's bed. And sometimes, he leaves one behind to carry the memory. Those words sound gentle until you realize that behind them lurked a ledger, counting each family's belongings as assets to be liquidated for cash. The chapel's hidden basement became a vault of horrors. Fine china, family Bibles, gold coins, baby clothes, wedding rings all locked away, waiting to be sold to black market traders and settlements across Oregon territory. And every night, as the families wept and prayed, Brother Ezekiel was below ground, sorting through the spoils of murder. They weren't just killers, one investigator would later write. They were bookkeepers of death. And while the nation romanticized the pioneer spirit, the Graysons were busy perfecting a formula where murder was business, and business was good, because nothing on the Oregon Trail was more lethal than misplaced faith. If you're fascinated by true crime, hidden history, and the grim secrets buried under America's frontier myths, smash that like button, subscribe for more dark revelations, and tell me in the comments, would you have stepped into the Sacred Heart Chapel, or kept riding west because on the Oregon Trail, faith might save your soul, but it could also seal your grave. Out on the Oregon Trail, danger was supposed to wear the face of raging rivers, wild animals, or hostile warriors. But the deadliest threat was waiting behind a pulpit, whispering holy words while stirring poison into your tea. As pioneers pushed their wagons west, they believed they were fleeing the dangers of the old world for a promised land. But east of the Blue Mountains, in a lonely pocket of Oregon territory, salvation became a mask for slaughter. And it all began in 1852 at the height of the Great Migration, when more than 50,000 souls braved the 2,000-mile stretch from Missouri to Oregon, their hearts full of hope, their wagons laden with everything they owned. Most of them knew the odds were grim. Cholera, typhoid, snake bites, freezing nights. The graves of the fallen lined the trail like mile markers of doom. But even the most cynical pioneer could not imagine that a place calling itself the Sacred Heart Chapel would be the final stop on their journey. Because here, death didn't come charging on horseback. It wore a crucifix and spoke of God's mercy. The Graysons were strategic predators who mastered every detail of human vulnerability. By the time families crawled into their territory, they were physically broken, spiritually fragile, and low on rations. The Graysons positioned themselves not simply as preachers, but as problem solvers. They offered medicine for sickness, repairs for wagons, and the comforting promise of a Christian burial for loved ones lost along the trail. To those drowning in despair, the Graysons seemed like angels. But angels don't keep ledgers of the people they bury. Father Morai's sermons weren't random religious ramblings. He tailored each one like a custom suit. For Methodists, he preached divine healing and the power of prayer. For Presbyterians, he spoke of predestination and God's unknowable plan. For Baptists, he invoked the promise of personal salvation and heavenly reunion. He was a chameleon of faith, molding his message to match his listeners. A good preacher saves souls, Morai once told a traveler, but a wise one knows how to shepherd his flock and their possessions. Meanwhile, Sister Constance delivered comfort with a lethal twist. Her so-called blessed remedies were laced with precise doses of arsenic. The symptoms: vomiting, diarrhea, skin turning gray mimicked trail diseases so perfectly that no one questioned the deaths. On the frontier, entire families could be wiped out by a single sickness overnight. The Graysons exploited that grim truth with merciless precision. As pioneers wailed over fresh graves, Father Morai led funerals with tearful prayers and solemn hymns. To grieving husbands, he spoke of God's will. To widows, he whispered of heavenly reunions. All the while, Brother Ezekiel was rummaging through wagons, inventorying tools, jewelry, family heirlooms, every object that could turn the Graysons a profit. Some families lost children to the river, an investigator would later say. The ones who stopped at Sacred Heart Chapel lost everything, including their names. In the cold darkness of the Oregon nights, the chapel's basement held the true legacy of the Graysons. Piles of stolen goods were sorted and categorized for sale. Brother Ezekiel transported these items discreetly to trading posts and settlements, telling believable stories of families who had gone back east or perished from trail sickness. He became the face of grief-turned-commerce. But the real genius of the Graysons wasn't just in poisoning the body. It was in poisoning the mind. They made people believe that questioning them was equal to questioning God. And on the Oregon Trail, where every sunrise might be your last, the comfort of faith was worth more than any gold coin. People will die for faith, Morai once said, but they'll hand you everything they own if you convince them God wants it that way. This is why the Oregon Trail murders remain one of the most chilling sagas in America's darkest history, because the Graysons didn't just kill. They built an empire on trust, sanctified their crimes with scripture, and left over 800 pioneers buried in shallow, forgotten graves. If this story sends a chill down your spine, hit that like button, subscribe for more tales of true crime, hidden history, and the dark truths America tried to bury. And tell me in the comments, would you have seen through Father Morai's holy mask, or would you have drunk the tea? How many times have you heard this, God sent you here for a reason? Now ask yourself, what if that reason was to die, out here on the Oregon Trail? The line between divine providence and mortal peril blurred into dust under wagon wheels. Families staggered westward through 2,000 miles of wilderness, believing each sunrise might bring them closer to salvation. But in the shadowed hills of eastern Oregon, salvation wasn't a destination. It was a baited trap, and the Graysons were waiting with open arms. When pioneers reached the Blue Mountains, they were spent. They'd already crossed rivers swollen with spring snowmelt, buried loved ones beneath crude wooden markers, seen oxen collapse in harness, tongues lolling from dehydration. Hope kept them moving, but hope also made them vulnerable. By mile 1,800, they were perfect targets, broke, desperate, and starving for a sign that their suffering had meaning. That sign often came in the shape of a modest wooden steeple against the Oregon sky. Sacred Heart Chapel. The chapel sat perched on a hill above a shallow valley, a place travelers naturally stopped to water animals and bury their dead. Its roof was weathered gray. The door simple pine. No stained glass. No gold. Just stark wooden walls and a cross Father Morai claimed he carved himself. To the untrained eye, it looked humble, a place where a holy man could minister to souls battered by the trail. But behind that simple facade was the greatest murder-for-profit scheme the American frontier had ever known. God doesn't always arrive on a white horse, Father Morai liked to say. Sometimes he arrives in the disguise of human kindness. And so the Graysons wove kindness into a noose. Morai himself was the perfect spider at the center of the web. He stood well over 6 feet, painfully thin, with steel-gray eyes that seemed to pierce a man's private sins. His voice could shift from booming preacher's thunder to gentle bedside whisper. He wore his black frock coat like a badge of authority, quoting scripture as fluently as a man might recite the alphabet. But his true genius was reading people. He could see the cracks in a man's faith and knew exactly where to press. Beside him, Sister Constance moved through crowds like a ghost of compassion. She was neither too young nor too old. Her soft smile as disarming as her hands were skilled. Mothers trusted her immediately, especially those whose children were feverish and wasting away. To them, Constance was the angel they'd prayed for, a woman who smelled faintly of lavender and spoke gently of God's healing grace. But lavender can't mask the scent of arsenic forever. Then there was Brother Ezekiel, the silent architect of logistics. He'd greet wagon trains with a weathered grin, as if he'd just returned from helping someone else in crisis. He could fix a broken axle in an hour. He knew how to calm spooked oxen. But more importantly, he knew how to spot wealth hidden under patched clothing. A fine rifle tucked beneath a wagon seat. A locket glinting in the firelight. The Graysons didn't just save souls, they appraised assets. Families often encountered the Graysons when they needed help most. A wheel cracked on a rutted trail, a child burning with fever, an old man collapsing in the dust. That was the moment Ezekiel would appear, seemingly by coincidence, offering aid and guiding them toward the chapel. It felt like a miracle. It was actually a sentence of death. The pioneers who entered Sacred Heart Chapel described feeling instant relief. Cool shadows replaced the blazing Oregon sun. The scent of wood polish and dried herbs filled the air. Father Marai would greet them personally, extending a hand scarred from honest work, or so he claimed. "Welcome, brothers and sisters," he'd say. "You have come to the Lord's house. Here, your suffering has meaning." And just like that, the Graysons owned them. Because on the Oregon Trail, people wanted to believe that God would reward their struggle, that he wouldn't let innocent children die in a wagon rut. The Graysons weaponized that belief, using faith as both blade and shield. And once inside, travelers were lulled into a deadly comfort, blind to the quiet inventory Ezekiel took of every trunk, every piece of jewelry, every hidden stash of gold. They didn't kill with bullets, an investigator later said. They killed with hope. This is why the Oregon Trail murders still haunt the shadows of American history, because the Graysons didn't wait for victims to stumble upon them. They created opportunities, crafted miracles, and turned moments of grace into a one-way ticket to a grave beneath the pines. If you're fascinated by true crime, hidden history, and secrets darker than any outlaw legend, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Would you have recognized the predator hiding behind the pulpit? Because on the Oregon Trail, the road to heaven was sometimes paved straight to hell. What if the place you prayed for deliverance was the very place plotting your demise on the Oregon Trail? Miracles were rare and always suspicious. Families trudging through 1,800 miles of brutal wilderness arrived in eastern Oregon, shattered, physically starved, mentally frayed, and emotionally desperate for signs that God still saw them. And waiting in that fragile place between faith and fear was Sacred Heart Chapel, a structure that seemed built by angels, but belonged to monsters. This was how the Graysons played their first, deadly card. They offered comfort before they demanded trust. And once they had trust, they harvested everything else. To a pioneer standing on the Oregon Trail, Sacred Heart looked humble. Built from rough timber, the chapel's roof carried the silver gray of years under harsh sun and storm. A wooden cross rose above the front door, catching the glow of dawn like a beacon for weary travelers. Beside it stood a modest cemetery, its crosses leaning at odd angles, inscriptions faded by wind and time. But nothing was accidental. The chapel's location was perfect, a natural rest stop where wagon trains slowed to water oxen, bury the dead, and pray that the worst was behind them. Instead, the worst was about to begin. Father Marai Grayson would step from the chapel door, robes fluttering in the wind, eyes glittering like steel under sunlight. His presence was hypnotic. He radiated both command and compassion. And his first words were always an invitation draped in faith. Brothers and sisters, you have come farther than most. Let us help you finish your journey. It was a simple sentence, but it carried the power of a lifeline thrown to drowning men. Marai knew precisely how to read a traveler's soul. He'd tilt his head, his piercing gray eyes narrowing slightly, gauging whether the pioneer before him was devout, skeptical, or already lost in grief. And he'd adjust his approach on the fly. For the fiercely religious, he quoted scripture fluently, peppering his speech with references to God's tests and the promise of eternal reward. For the cautious or suspicious, he offered practical aid: water, shelter, repairs. No one left untouched by his influence. Beside him, Sister Constance was the soft echo of his thunder. She moved quietly, eyes warm, hands gentle as she checked pulses and brushed sweat from foreheads. She carried small satchels of herbs and bottles of tinctures, offering them to mothers terrified that their coughing child might not survive another night. Her voice was a balm. Her presence made strong men weep with relief. "Let me tend your little one," she'd whisper. "The Lord works through humble hands." Brother Ezekiel hovered on the edges, a quiet observer. He'd kneel to examine a cracked wheel, run skilled fingers over iron bands, and mutter advice about axle grease and spares. He seemed trustworthy, an honest man who wanted nothing more than to help pioneers get safely to Oregon City. But while his hands worked, his eyes cataloged every item in your wagon. The fine blankets, the glint of gold tucked under a child's pillow, the weight of hidden coin purses. To Ezekiel, a wagon train was a walking inventory list. Here was the genius of the Graysons. They understood that after months of endless hardship, a simple offer of kindness was enough to disarm even the most guarded soul. No pioneer expected the people smiling at them beneath a wooden cross to be the architects of their destruction. Morai preached that God was calling people westward for a divine purpose. And he convinced pioneers that the Graysons were part of that purpose. To question them felt like questioning God's plan. In a place where typhoid and cholera killed silently in the night, few dared challenge those who claimed to bring heavenly salvation. But there was one detail that never quite sat right with some travelers. Why was the basement so large? Why did Sister Constance always prepare her remedies in private? Why did Brother Ezekiel insist on inspecting every wagon, even those belonging to grieving widows? Of course, the Graysons always had explanations. "The Lord helps those who help themselves," Morai would say, his smile a blade in disguise. "We must be good stewards of his house and protect it from thieves." It was brilliant psychological warfare, guilt mixed with gratitude. And that's how families walked willingly into the Graysons' lair. Exhausted, starved for mercy. They mistook predators for angels. They believed the Graysons were the answer to their prayers. Instead, they were about to become entries in a blood-soaked ledger hidden beneath the chapel floorboards. Out here, faith wasn't just salvation. One investigator later said, it was a weapon, and the Graysons wielded it with surgical precision. If you're obsessed with the secrets buried in America's darkest history, hit that like button. Subscribe for more twisted truths. And tell me in the comments, could you tell the difference between a savior and a killer in a preacher's robe? Because on the Oregon Trail, the answer might have meant life or an unmarked grave beneath the Oregon pines. Have you ever wondered how easily a prayer can become a death sentence on the Oregon Trail? The line between faith and fatality was razor thin. And nowhere was that line more blurred than inside the Sacred Heart Chapel, a place that promised divine sanctuary, but instead orchestrated the most systematic slaughter in American frontier history. By 1852, more than 50,000 souls had braved the 2,000-mile gauntlet from Missouri to Oregon, believing in the American dream. But for hundreds, that dream ended in a wooden building where hymns echoed off blood-stained walls. This is the grim reality. Families didn't just disappear along the Oregon Trail. They were processed, evaluated, and executed with businesslike precision. The Graysons perfected the art of mass murder because they understood the frontier's greatest truth. People were desperate for hope, and desperation makes people blind. Father Morai Grayson knew this better than any gunfighter or outlaw. He was the ultimate illusionist, wrapping evil in the soft glow of salvation. He'd welcome weary travelers into the chapel, his face set in solemn empathy, his words crafted to soothe frayed nerves. "The Lord brought you here for a reason," he'd say. "Let us help ease your burden." But behind those words was an unspoken transaction. Your trust for your life. For the Graysons, religion wasn't a calling. It was camouflage. And business. Every detail of the Sacred Heart Chapel was designed to disarm suspicion. The simple wooden pews, the humble altar, the small cemetery outside, which seemed like a gesture of charity for burying the dead along the trail. All of it was stagecraft. The real sermons weren't preached from the pulpit, one investigator later wrote. They were whispered over dying men's beds, convincing families to stay just one more night. Sister Constance was the gentle enforcer of the scheme. She moved with quiet grace, speaking in hushed tones about God's healing herbs. She mixed concoctions in the basement, claiming they would ease fevers and purge trail toxins. But every bottle was a silent blade. Arsenic became her sacrament. Sometimes the body must be cleansed, she'd whisper, so the soul may be saved. Brother Ezekiel, meanwhile, blended into the background, always helpful, always polite. He'd slip between wagons, checking wheels, inspecting axles, chatting with children, and offering mechanical expertise. But his true mission was surveillance. He memorized what families carried: gold coins sewn into hems, heirlooms wrapped in cloth, the hidden glint of silver beneath blankets. He was the Graysons' walking inventory ledger. To him, every wagon was a bank vault on wheels, and it was all so heartbreakingly believable. On the trail, people expected to die of cholera, not conspiracy. A child vomiting blood, it must be dysentery. A mother's sudden collapse, probably exhaustion from the journey. That was the genius of the Graysons' plan. They weaponized the same diseases that everyone feared. The first clue, something was terribly wrong, came from the chapel's basement. Travelers noticed its size was unnaturally large for such a small church. They were told it was used to store supplies for destitute pioneers. But the truth was far more sinister. Inside, the Graysons kept meticulous records of every victim they murdered. Ledgers written in Father Morai's precise handwriting listed names, possessions seized, dates of death, and profits earned from selling stolen goods. Each entry read like an account book from hell. Morrison family, 5 souls, gold coins, furniture, quality tools, bodies interred in Grove Section C. Estimated profit $400. Method: arsenic via medicinal teas. Duration 17 days. To the Graysons, people weren't people. They were assets to be liquidated. And that's why suspicion almost never took root. The Graysons controlled the narrative. They'd perform elaborate Christian burials, weeping beside grieving families. They'd speak of God's will and remind survivors that disease was part of the wilderness trial. And those survivors, broken by grief, dared not question the only people offering them comfort. Morai understood the darkness lurking in every human soul. He knew that people would rather accept a comforting lie than stare into the abyss. Faith is a gift, he once said, but it's also a leash. This is why the Oregon Trail murders remain one of the most haunting stories in America's hidden history. Because in a land that prided itself on freedom and courage, hundreds died at the hands of killers who wore the mask of divine mercy. If this makes you question who you'd trust out there on the frontier, hit like, subscribe for more shocking truths from America's past, and drop a comment: could you spot the monster hiding in the man of God? Because on the Oregon Trail, salvation was sometimes the most dangerous illusion of all. Out there on the trail, pioneers learned one brutal truth: the lonelier you are, the easier it is for the devil to reach you. As families rolled toward the Blue Mountains, they felt the distance from civilization in every bone. The trees seemed to lean closer, as if whispering secrets only the wind could understand. And that's when the Graysons struck hardest, when travelers were too isolated to scream for help. By the time a wagon limped into the clearing below Sacred Heart Chapel, its passengers were already half defeated. The miles had bled them dry. Supplies dwindled. Children coughed blood in the night. Mothers stared hollow-eyed into the fire, praying that God would spare just one more child. Into that chasm of fear stepped Father Morai Grayson, promising healing, shelter, and salvation. But what he really offered was a cage. This was how the Graysons escalated from kindness to control. At first, they offered help: food, shelter, medical care. But once a family accepted, subtle walls began to close around them. Father Morai would gently insist they stay longer for safety. He'd hint at sickness sweeping the trail, invisible threats only he could diagnose. Sister Constance would whisper warnings about trail fever, nodding gravely as she mixed her deadly teas. And Brother Ezekiel became the quiet warden, always nearby, noting who might try to leave. The Oregon wilderness, once open and endless, became a prison. And the Graysons held the keys. They didn't chain people up, an investigator would later say. They chained their minds. This is where the feeling of total isolation began to sink in for the victims. There were no other settlements for miles. The closest trading post lay 15 miles east, but few dared make the journey once Father Morai filled their heads with fear. The Graysons controlled the only safe haven for 100 miles, and they knew it. As days passed, healthy travelers started dropping one by one. It always began the same way: stomach cramps, fatigue, vomiting. Sister Constance diagnosed trail sickness and administered her so-called remedies. But the remedies were poison. While families nursed the dying, the Graysons tightened their psychological grip. Morai preached that God tested the faithful through suffering. He spoke of families called home together, spinning tragedy into divine purpose. And in that moment, the victim's grief became their own gag order. Who would accuse the man burying your child of murder? And that's what made the Graysons unstoppable. People didn't dare suspect the holy figures who prayed beside their sickbeds. Suspicion felt like blasphemy. It felt like betraying the only people who seemed to care. But the poison didn't just kill the body, it eroded the mind. Victims became too weak to travel, too dizzy to think clearly. Some even began defending the Graysons, insisting they were doing their best despite the mounting graves. It was psychological warfare executed with surgical precision. By the time you realized the Graysons were killers, one survivor said, you were too sick to run. Meanwhile, Brother Ezekiel kept tally of every asset. He noted who had gold hidden in pockets, who possessed fine rifles, sewing machines, or heirloom jewelry. To him, the dying were just merchandise waiting for liquidation. Outside, the Oregon wind howled through pine trees, carrying the sweet scent of sap and sometimes the metallic whisper of freshly dug earth. Because while travelers wept inside the chapel, the Graysons were out back digging graves, one victim, then the next, then the next. This is where the Graysons revealed their true genius. They didn't just kill families, they erased them. No records, no gravestones with names, just shallow pits under pine needles, each one holding a chapter of America's forgotten history. Morai was often heard saying, "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. We are merely his instruments." But those words weren't theology. They were a business plan. By the time any traveler suspected the truth, they were trapped. Even if they tried to leave, Ezekiel would quietly sabotage wagons, remove vital parts, or scare oxen into running off. And who would believe a half-delirious pioneer claiming that a man of God was orchestrating murders in a place where death was everywhere? One lawman later said, "The Graysons made murder look normal." This is why the Oregon Trail murders continue to haunt America's darkest history. Because the Graysons didn't rely on violence. They used isolation, sickness, and faith to suffocate every escape route. If you're obsessed with true crime, hidden history, and secrets darker than any outlaw's bullet, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, would you have seen the bars of the Graysons' invisible prison, or would you have prayed as they dug your grave? There's a special kind of terror that comes when you realize your prayers have led you into the jaws of a predator. On the Oregon Trail, travelers faced storms, disease, and starvation, but none of it compared to the invisible trap laid by the Grayson family. What made them so deadly wasn't just arsenic or false sermons. It was the way they turned people's own faith into a prison. As days passed inside Sacred Heart Chapel, families started feeling a suffocating weight pressing down on their chests. They noticed subtle details first, the way Father Marai's eyes lingered a beat too long on pockets where gold might be hidden. The way Sister Constance always shooed people away from her brewing table. The way Brother Ezekiel hovered by wagons at night, pretending to check oxen while peering into trunks. And suddenly, the pioneers realized they were no longer guests. They were captives. The genius of the Graysons was that they didn't need force. They built their prison out of fear and guilt. Marai constantly reminded families that leaving might spread the sickness further along the trail. Sister Constance claimed that the wilderness was crawling with bandits who'd murder them for a sack of flour. And Ezekiel quietly sabotaged wagons, removing bolts, cracking wheels, loosening bindings so even if someone tried to flee, they'd be stranded before sundown. They didn't need chains, one investigator said. They made the wilderness your cell. Meanwhile, the poison did its quiet work. At first, it was just fatigue and headaches, then vomiting, violent cramps, skin paling to ashen gray. And every symptom matched some known disease on the trail: cholera, dysentery, typhoid. Families told themselves, this happens to everyone out here. But deep down, a chilling doubt started to grow. And that's when Morai would strike with his most devastating weapon: false comfort. He'd kneel beside the dying, clasp their hands, and say things like, "The Lord chooses whom he calls home. Trust in his wisdom." Those words weren't comfort. They were anesthesia, numbing the will to fight. The isolation was total. There were no neighbors, no patrols, no telegraphs to summon help. Families who might have banded together were scattered miles apart on the trail. Anyone who tried to leave risked getting lost, starving, or being accused of carrying plague. And all the while, the Graysons smiled. They kept you sick enough to stay, but alive enough to keep looting you, another survivor said. And that looting wasn't random. Ezekiel maintained detailed ledgers hidden in the chapel's basement, listing every item taken, every dollar's worth calculated. Fine china from Missouri families, jewelry from German immigrants, precious tools from blacksmiths seeking new futures out west. Each was noted with cold precision. Morrison family 5 souls. Inventory: gold coins, heirlooms, quality furniture, method arsenic via medicinal teas. Net profit $400. To the Graysons, human lives were just numbers on a page. And while the dying lay groaning on wooden cots, the Graysons planned the next harvest. Morai would practice sermons tailored to new denominations. Sister Constance refined her poison dosages for maximum delay in symptoms, and Ezekiel plotted which trading posts would pay the most for stolen goods without asking questions. It was murder industrialized. The horror of it all was how normal it appeared. Children still played in the chapel yard, laughing weakly even as their bodies began to fail. Hymns still drifted from the chapel rafters. Travelers still bowed their heads for prayers. But beneath it all lay a creeping dread that whispered, "We're all already dead." Those who grew suspicious faced impossible choices. Escape meant certain death in the wilderness. Staying meant slow murder disguised as mercy. And the Graysons thrived in that tension. They fed on it. Morai's final blow was always the same. He'd lean close and say, "Some trials are sent by God to test the faithful. Do not run from your trial. Embrace it." And that's how families surrendered to the slaughter. This is why the Oregon Trail murders remain a terrifying relic of America's darkest history. Because the Graysons proved the most lethal predators don't hide in the shadows, they stand in the open, offering salvation while measuring you for your grave. If you're obsessed with true crime, hidden history, and the monstrous secrets lurking behind holy faces, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, would you have escaped the Graysons' chapel or prayed for mercy as they counted your silver? Imagine looking into the eyes of your killer and thanking them for saving your life. On the Oregon Trail, that nightmare wasn't a story, it was reality. As the Graysons tightened their grip on unsuspecting pioneers, the sense of danger became a suffocating fog. The further families stepped into the sacred walls of the chapel, the less chance they had of ever stepping out alive. By the second week of a family's stay, patterns emerged that should have set off alarms, but grief and exhaustion made people blind. The same children who played outside the chapel gates were now shivering with fevers. The same men who'd arrived strong enough to fix wagon wheels were curled in agony on wooden bunks. And Sister Constance, with her gentle hands and murmured prayers, became the angel of death. Trail sickness, she'd say softly, as a child vomited blood beside her. God tests us so we may learn humility. But in truth, the Graysons were administering calculated doses of arsenic, each symptom a tool for control. The sicker the families became, the more dependent they were on the Graysons for care. And every dying gasp meant one less witness, one less person who might warn the next wagon rolling west. Father Marai orchestrated the psychological side of the operation with chilling expertise. He'd speak in hushed tones about how God sometimes called entire families home together. He'd quote scripture about the rewards waiting for the faithful in heaven, and he'd lean close and whisper, "Sometimes, the Lord removes the weak so the strong may prosper." Those words were the true poison. Because even as fathers buried their children in the frozen Oregon soil, they still trusted the Graysons. They still believed these holy people were risking their own lives to nurse the sick. And that's what made escape nearly impossible. The wilderness outside the chapel was a vast, indifferent ocean of pine and dust. 15 miles to the nearest settlement. Endless miles of desolate trail beyond that. And even if you mustered the courage to flee, you'd be leaving behind sick loved ones. For many, the choice wasn't flight or death, it was flight and certain death. Meanwhile, Brother Ezekiel worked the shadows. He'd slip into wagons while families were distracted by their own tragedy. He'd pry open hidden compartments, feeling for the soft chime of coins sewn into hems or the solid clink of silver buried under blankets. To him, every family was a ledger entry. Ezekiel wasn't just a thief, one lawman later said. He was a human calculator. The basement of the Sacred Heart Chapel became an underground bank vault of grief. There, the Graysons stored piles of stolen goods lockets engraved with initials, wedding rings, fine china from Missouri, delicate clocks from German immigrants. Each item was tagged and logged, destined for black market buyers who asked no questions. And as the piles of gold and goods grew, so did the body count. Morrison family. 5 souls. Inventory gold coins. Fine tools. Quality furniture. Method arsenic via medicinal teas. Net profit $400. To the Graysons, that entry wasn't horrific. It was business. The cruel genius of it all was that the chapel never looked sinister. The sunlight streamed through the windows. Hymns floated through the halls. The smell of pine wood mingled with incense. And the Graysons moved through it all with practiced serenity. They made murder feel like mercy. Yet some survivors began to piece the puzzle together. Catherine Patterson, the woman who would later become the star witness against the Graysons, remembered seeing Sister Constance slip a white powder into a child's drink. She recalled how Ezekiel spent more time cataloging possessions than tending the sick. But by the time suspicion bloomed, it was often too late. Families were too weak, too scattered, too afraid. By the time you questioned the Graysons, Catherine said, they already owned your soul. This is why the Oregon Trail murders remain one of the most terrifying sagas in America's darkest history. Because the Graysons didn't just steal lives, they stole trust, the single most precious currency on the frontier. If you're addicted to true crime, hidden history, and the twisted secrets buried beneath America's pioneer myths, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, would you have trusted the gentle hands of Sister Constance, or felt the poison in your veins too late? Because on the Oregon Trail, even a prayer could become your death warrant. Faith can move mountains, or bury entire families beneath them. For years, The Sacred Heart Chapel stood like a silent sentinel above the Oregon Trail, promising weary travelers a refuge carved by God's own hand. But inside its walls was a secret so vile that it shattered every illusion of holiness. Because hidden beneath prayers and psalms was the greatest ledger of murder the American frontier ever recorded. And when that ledger was finally pried open, it didn't just reveal crimes, it annihilated faith itself. It began when soldiers from Fort Dalles, acting on the desperate testimony of Catherine Patterson, stormed the Sacred Heart Chapel in 1855. The chapel looked harmless enough: timber walls, a modest altar, and rows of pews polished smooth by years of grieving pioneers. But Catherine's story of poison and deception rang too true for authorities to ignore. They searched the chapel from pulpit to rafters and found nothing at first. Until one soldier noticed a faint seam in the floorboards behind the altar. He pried up a plank, and the darkness underneath swallowed the room. Beneath the chapel was a hidden basement that sprawled wider than the building itself. Inside, lanterns flickered over shelves stacked with stolen lives, fine dresses from Missouri pioneers, hand-carved clocks brought by German immigrants, Bibles inscribed with names now long forgotten, chests stuffed with gold coins, silver spoons, wedding rings, and next to them, ledgers thick with dust, but fresh with ink. Father Morai's handwriting filled every page. The same graceful, sweeping script he used in sermons now documented cold-blooded murder like bookkeeping for a general store. Each line was a sentence of death. Morrison family. 5 souls. Bodies interred Grove Section C. Possessions 2 gold coins. Quality furniture. Tools. Method arsenic via medicinal teas. Duration 17 days. Net profit $400. Page after page. Name after name. The Graysons hadn't just killed. They'd commodified human lives. Soldiers stood silent, staring at the mountain of stolen goods. Even hardened men who'd fought in the Mexican War trembled. One captain reportedly whispered, "This isn't a chapel. This is a slaughterhouse." But the horror wasn't only in the inventory of the dead. It was in how perfectly the Graysons understood human psychology. They knew families would vanish on the Oregon Trail without questions asked. They knew survivors would blame cholera or Indian raids before suspecting holy people. And they knew how to craft grief into silence. They didn't just bury bodies. Catherine Patterson testified. They buried the truth. Authorities uncovered secret passages used by Ezekiel to transport goods out of the chapel unseen. They found tools stained with blood. And deeper still, they found graves, dozens of them, hidden in a grove behind the chapel. Shallow pits filled with the remains of men, women, and children. Their bones twisted in final agony. No markers. No prayers said over their resting place. Just forgotten souls. Consumed by the forest floor. The final blow to faith came when investigators read Father Morai's personal journal. Early entries showed a man trying to justify his actions as God's will. But as the years progressed, his writing turned colder. He no longer spoke of salvation. He spoke of prophets, of perfecting methods, of purifying the trail of the weak. These people were dying anyway, Morai wrote in 1854. We simply guided them sooner to the Lord and took what they would no longer need. That single sentence snapped the spine of trust across the frontier. Because if a man who preached God's love could systematically murder entire families and record it all as a business ledger, then what else was possible? Whom could anyone trust? Suddenly, every lone missionary on the trail was suspect. Every helping hand might be a blade waiting for your back. The echoes of hymns were replaced by whispers of paranoia. Faith used to be our shield, one pioneer wrote afterward. Now it feels like a loaded gun pointed at our hearts. This is why the Oregon Trail murders remain one of the darkest chapters in America's hidden history. Because the Graysons didn't just slaughter bodies. They shattered the frontier's most precious commodity, the belief that goodness always wore a holy face. If this truth shakes you, smash that like button Subscribe for more forbidden tales, and drop a comment, could you forgive God for letting monsters hide behind his name? Because on the Oregon Trail, sometimes the gravest danger wasn't the wilderness outside, but the preacher smiling beside you. The scariest monsters are the ones who make you thank them while they tighten the noose. In the wilderness of the Oregon Trail, pioneers learned to fear wolves, rattlesnakes, and swollen rivers. But what they never suspected was that the gravest danger wore a preacher's robe and spoke of salvation. When federal marshals finally cracked open the hidden compartments beneath the Sacred Heart Chapel, what they discovered was so staggering. It ripped apart every certainty the frontier held sacred. They found not merely evidence of murder, but a dark blueprint for how trust itself could be weaponized. Each dusty shelf in that underground chamber told the same story faith exploited for profit. Fine china wrapped in burlap, child-sized shoes with blood still dark on the soles, journals written in trembling script, describing final days of agony while praising the kindness of Father Marai. And above all, the ledger's pages and pages of meticulous records. Father Marai's handwriting recorded lives reduced to numbers, names, ages, possessions, causes of death. Some entries were heartbreakingly brief. Hoffman family, 6 souls. Goods taken clockmaker's tools. Fine textiles, gold coins. Method small arsenic doses via preventive tonics. Timeline 28 days. Profit $670. Other entries were detailed, describing how best to adjust doses to prolong suffering while maintaining the illusion of natural illness. It was murder refined into a business model. For the marshals and soldiers reading those pages, it was like staring into the mind of a creature that wore humanity as a disguise. These weren't simply crimes of greed or desperation. They were methodical, cold, and staggeringly effective. We believed cholera was the trail's deadliest killer. One investigator wrote in his official report. We were wrong. The deadliest killer was faith misplaced. Perhaps the most horrifying part was how the Graysons manipulated grief itself as a weapon. When a child died, Marai would stand over the small body, his voice breaking with emotion as he quoted scripture about heaven's gates opening for the innocent. He'd clasp the grieving mother's hands and whisper, "Your child is with the angels now. You must stay and rest. God needs you strong." Meanwhile, Brother Ezekiel would slip into the wagon and catalog every valuable left behind by the deceased. Every prayer was a transaction, every hymn a distraction, every grave a receipt. But it was Sister Constance who delivered the final blow to the victim's sanity. Even as families suspected something was wrong, they could not fathom accusing the woman who wiped their brows and whispered gentle prayers. And that was precisely how the Graysons maintained control. Who would ever accuse an angel of murder? Families trapped in the chapel fell into a psychological vice. Leave and you risked dying alone in the wilderness, pursued by the very sickness Morai warned about. Stay and you risked dying one by one, each death disguised as God's mysterious will. And so they stayed, praying, hoping, dying. For Catherine Patterson, the woman whose escape finally shattered the Graysons' operation, the moment of realization came too late to save her family. She recalled watching her sister Emily gently sip a tonic prepared by Constance. Hours later, Emily's skin turned ashen, her breathing shallow. Even then, Catherine tried to convince herself it was trail fever. "I wanted to believe God would not let such evil wear his robes," she later testified. But the truth is, God did not stop them. And that broke me. And that's what the Graysons truly stole, the belief that faith was safe. After the chapel's secrets were exposed, fear rippled down the Oregon Trail like a plague of its own. Families who once huddled gratefully at the sight of a cross now shied away, suspicious of every preacher, every missionary, every gentle healer offering aid. The entire notion of Christian charity was tainted. The Graysons didn't just kill people. One lawman concluded. They killed trust, This is why the Oregon Trail murders remain seared into the pages of America's darkest history. Because the Graysons didn't only bury bodies, they buried belief itself, leaving an entire generation to wonder if God was ever listening, or if the devil simply learned how to preach. If this revelation chills your bones, hit that like button, subscribe for more dark truths, and tell me in the comments, would you have dared to accuse the preacher? Even as your family lay dying, because on the Oregon Trail, sometimes salvation was the cruelest death sentence of all. The cruelest betrayal isn't from your enemies, it's from those you kneel beside to pray. For months along the Oregon Trail, rumors had circulated of families vanishing without a trace. Some whispered about disease, others blamed hostile tribes. But when the soldiers and marshals finally forced open the secrets beneath Sacred Heart Chapel, they uncovered a truth so monstrous, it shattered the very idea of faith itself. The evidence wasn't just physical, it was psychological carnage. Soldiers found the Graysons' ledgers, but they also found personal letters, journals, and scribbled scraps of prayer notes from victims who'd realized too late that they were living among killers. "If we die here," one woman wrote in trembling script, "tell my family it was the preacher who did it." It was the ultimate nightmare, victims forced to pretend gratitude toward the very people murdering them. Families lay dying on narrow cots, whispering thanks to Father Murray as he recited psalms over their beds. Meanwhile, in the hidden basement, Brother Ezekiel sorted through their trunks and tallied every possession as profit. They were angels on the outside, one lawman later said, but their prayers were just the sound of wolves circling a campfire. The true horror lay in how methodical the Graysons were. They weren't simply killers. They were entrepreneurs of death. Father Murray had created a sliding scale for arsenic doses, refining exactly how sick each victim should become to avoid suspicion. Families needed to linger long enough to justify their stay, but not so long that their story might reach other travelers. His ledgers were filled with clinical observations: Weatherby family suspicious patriarch, delay full poisoning, increase microdose to female family members first to ensure compliance. It wasn't just murder, it was behavioral science weaponized. And it worked. Because pioneers who came through those chapel doors were already half broken. Months of harsh trail life had emptied their spirits. Losing a child felt like God's punishment, not a crime. Murray seized on that guilt like a vulture. He'd kneel by grieving parents and murmur, "The Lord sometimes calls entire families home to spare them further suffering." Those words hit like a hammer blow to the soul. And that's how the Graysons pulled off their greatest illusion. They made the victims blame themselves. Meanwhile, Sister Constance's gentle voice was the final trap. Mothers trusted her implicitly as she mixed remedies. When children screamed in pain, she'd hush them and sing soft hymns. Her presence was disarmingly maternal, cloaking murder in compassion. I thought she was the only one who cared. Catherine Patterson later testified, until I saw her pouring white powder into my nephew's drink. The ledgers held a tally of death like an accountant's log. The total number of victims reached over 150 before the Pattersons exposed the truth. Each family entered into those dusty pages represented dreams erased, futures stolen, and generations wiped out. But the Graysons didn't stop at material gain. Father Murray's journals revealed an ideology far darker than greed. In later entries, his writing shifted from financial notes to grandiose philosophy. He described himself as an agent of God, purging the weak from the path westward. The frontier must be claimed by the strongest. Murray wrote, "The diseased, the weak, the foolish, they are impediments to manifest destiny. We are the hand of divine selection." That single paragraph was the death knell for any comfort the American pioneers held in their hearts. Because it proved that the Graysons didn't simply want profit, they believed they were righteous. And that's the most terrifying killer of all, the one who thinks they're doing holy work. After the chapel's secrets became public, settlers across Oregon territory were gripped by a fear deeper than cholera: They stared at every traveling preacher with suspicion. Camps grew silent whenever a stranger in a black coat appeared. Trust evaporated like morning mist over wagon ruts. The Graysons didn't just kill people. One surviving pioneer said, "They killed the idea that a helping hand was ever safe." This is why the Oregon Trail murders remain a bleeding wound in America's darkest history. Because the Graysons took the frontier's last refuge faith and turned it into the deadliest weapon the wilderness had ever known. If this revelation makes your skin crawl, smash that like button, subscribe for more hidden truths, and tell me in the comments, would you have dared to challenge a preacher? Or would you have bowed your head while he dug your grave? Because on the Oregon Trail, the line between salvation and slaughter was thinner than a prayer whispered in the dark. The echoes of the Graysons didn't die in the chapel, they kept whispering across the Oregon Trail for generations. Even after the last plank of Sacred Heart Chapel burned under the furious hands of settlers in 1858, the horror refused to vanish. Because the Graysons hadn't just killed bodies, they'd poisoned something far deeper, the faith that bound pioneers together. The first and most immediate consequence was terror. For months after the raid, families traveling west eyed every stranger with suspicion. It didn't matter if he carried a Bible or wore a preacher's black coat. The notion that men of God could be systematic murderers shattered the fragile social fabric of frontier life. "We used to look for a cross as a sign of safety," one pioneer wrote in a letter. Now it feels like a warning. Every missionary station between the Blue Mountains and Oregon City found themselves under scrutiny. Soldiers stopped wagons, questioning preachers about their purpose, demanding to inspect basements and storage sheds. Rumors spread faster than the wind. Tales grew wilder, saying other chapels were doing the same thing, that no preacher could be trusted, that God himself had abandoned the trail. But the real wound was psychological. Even survivors who'd escaped the Graysons carried scars that never healed. Catherine Patterson, who'd exposed the operation, spent the rest of her life speaking out, warning travelers, testifying at trials. But her own nights were tormented by visions of her dying sister, and the gentle voice of Sister Constance urging her to drink blessed medicine. "Faith used to be my compass," Catherine later said. "Now I don't know which way is true north anymore." Her nephew Timothy, the little boy who survived, grew into a man who never married, never settled. He roamed the West as a guide for other wagon trains, driven by a single purpose: keep other families away from monsters who wore holy faces. The ripple effects went further still. Merchants across Oregon reported sudden drops in trade because families were too afraid to stop at roadside missions. Small churches in remote areas shut their doors, unable to convince travelers that they were innocent. And all the while, the memory of the Graysons hung over the trail like a thundercloud. The U.S. government took notice. The Grayson case forced the military to increase patrols along key routes, to protect migrants from predatory actors masquerading as clergy. Territorial governors urged new systems for tracking missing persons. The term trail fever became suspicious, no longer just a disease, but a potential cover for murder. But the most profound effect was cultural. The myth of the Oregon Trail. The brave families seeking paradise now carried a new footnote. Not everyone who helped you meant you well. It turned a tale of courage into a cautionary story. We thought the wilderness was our greatest enemy, one old pioneer said in his final interview. Turns out, it was the smiling man who offered us a hymn and a cup of tea. And that's why the Graysons have never truly vanished from America's nightmares. Their story became campfire warnings, whispered to children who stared wide-eyed into the darkness. It became a permanent stain on the idea that faith alone can save you. Because the Graysons proved a horrifying truth. The most dangerous predator is the one who learns your prayers and uses them to dig your grave. This is why the Oregon Trail murders remain a chilling chapter in America's darkest history. Because in the end, the wilderness wasn't the deadliest threat. The real wilderness was the human soul and the monsters who knew exactly how to hide inside it. If this lingering terror keeps you awake tonight, hit that like button, subscribe for more hidden truths, and drop a comment. Do you still trust a stranger offering help, Or has the ghost of the Graysons forever changed how you see a friendly smile on a lonely road? Some wounds don't bleed, they echo for generations. After the Sacred Heart Chapel burned, settlers thought they'd purged the darkness from Oregon's hills. But the truth was more haunting. Because the Graysons hadn't just murdered families. They'd rewritten the code of trust on the American frontier. The first sign of lasting damage was silence. Along the Oregon Trail, laughter once drifted from campfires. But after the Graysons, conversations shrank to whispers. Travelers who once swapped stories about helpful missionaries now spoke in cautious fragments, glancing over their shoulders. Because every smiling stranger could be another Morai Grayson in disguise. "We used to pray for help," one pioneer woman later said. "Now we pray that nobody talks to us at all." Entire communities began to unravel. Churches lost congregants who refused to gather in one place for fear of mass poisoning. Missionaries arriving in wagon trains were met not with gratitude, but with rifles pointed from wagon circles. Even the military found its authority shaken. Soldiers posted to forts along the trail were accused of plotting with fake preachers to rob migrants. The ripple effect touched the economy, too. Trading posts reported plummeting sales as migrants refused to stop near any station labeled Christian mission. Goods once moved swiftly from Missouri to Oregon slowed to a crawl. Some wagon trains turned back east, unwilling to risk dying not from cholera, but from a cup of blessed tea. But the worst scars were in the human spirit. Families who'd escaped the Graysons carried guilt as heavy as the mountains. Survivors like Catherine Patterson replayed every conversation, every prayer, asking themselves the same agonizing question: why didn't we see it sooner? "Sometimes I hear Sister Constance's voice at night," Catherine later confessed, "telling me God wanted my family home. And for a moment, I almost believe her." And that was the true legacy of the Graysons. They didn't just poison bodies, they poisoned memory itself. For the rest of her life, Catherine couldn't take medicine without suspecting murder. She avoided churches, unable to listen to scripture without hearing Morai's twisted sermons between the lines. Timothy Patterson, the child survivor, grew up unable to trust authority of any kind. He became a drifter, guiding wagon trains while warning families never to accept kindness too quickly. When asked why he refused to settle, he'd simply say, "Because the wolves learned how to pray." The Grayson case forced lawmakers to confront brutal realities. Territorial governors issued proclamations warning travelers to verify the identity of any religious groups. Forts were instructed to inspect any mission claiming to serve travelers. And a new kind of record-keeping emerged. Lists of missing persons circulated across forts and settlements, ensuring that families vanished less easily. But for many, no law could erase the nightmare. The Graysons had exposed how fragile frontier life truly was. People came west believing courage would protect them. But the Graysons proved courage alone wasn't enough. Because the real predator wasn't the wilderness, it was a man who learned to weaponize faith. Long after the trials ended, settlers still refused to camp near the ruins of the chapel. Superstitious stories blossomed. Some claimed to see pale figures in clerical robes drifting through the trees. Others swore they heard hymns echoing in the wind. "We burned the building," one old pioneer said, "but we'll never burn what they put in our heads." This is why the Oregon Trail murders remain stitched into the fabric of America's darkest history. Because the Graysons didn't just murder people, they murdered certainty. They turned belief itself into a liability. If this chilling legacy keeps your thoughts spinning tonight, hit that like button, subscribe for more forbidden tales, and tell me in the comments, could you ever trust a preacher again? Or would you hear the Graysons in every prayer? Because on the Oregon Trail, sometimes the most terrifying ghosts weren't in the forests, but in the hymns echoing through your own memory. Sometimes the dead don't haunt places. They haunt the silence left behind. Even after the Graysons were captured and the Sacred Heart Chapel was reduced to charred timber, their crimes refused to stay buried. The Oregon wind still carried echoes of hymns. Campfires flickered with shadows that seemed to whisper, "Trust no one." What lingered longest wasn't just fear. It was a savage question clawing at every survivor's mind. How many others were hiding behind holy faces along the Oregon Trail? Communities fractured under the weight of that suspicion. Preachers who once inspired comfort were now greeted with wary stares. Families stopped inviting strangers into their wagons. Mission stations, which once offered food and safety, found their pews empty and their donation boxes gathering dust. Faith used to bind us together, one pioneer said, voice shaking. Now it pushes us further apart. The ripple effect was relentless. Settlers who'd once leaned on each other in times of sickness now suffered in silence, terrified that any offer of medicine might be poison. Parents forbade their children from speaking to missionaries, and even the sound of a hymn drifting across the prairie sent shivers down spines. Merchants along the trail reported that travelers refused to stop for supplies if the store bore any hint of religious affiliation. One trader wrote bitterly, "The Graysons didn't just rob families. They robbed every honest man of his living." But perhaps the cruelest damage was psychological. People carried a wound they couldn't show, a constant buzzing doubt that hummed beneath every conversation. A mother who'd lost her child to sickness could never again hear a preacher's words without tasting bile. A father who'd seen Sister Constance mixing her powders could never again trust a woman offering comfort. "Even when I look into my own pastor's eyes," a survivor confessed years later, "I wonder if he's measuring my coffin." For Catherine Patterson, the weight was unbearable. Though hailed as the heroine who exposed the Graysons, she lived the rest of her life half convinced that evil was waiting to strike again. She refused to join any congregation. She shunned invitations to prayer circles, and every time she passed a church, she quickened her pace as if chased by ghosts. "God might forgive them," Catherine said once, "but I never will." Timothy Patterson, the boy who survived, carried his trauma like a second skin. He became a guide for westbound wagon trains but insisted on camping miles away from any chapel. His voice grew sharp whenever someone mentioned faith. "The wolves learned to wear crosses," he'd spit, "and they'll do it again if we let them." Lawmakers tried to contain the damage. Forts posted new regulations demanding background checks for missionaries. Territorial newspapers printed lists of known clergy to help travelers spot imposters. But fear outpaced every attempt at reassurance. This wasn't just a series of murders, one lawman said. It was a spiritual plague. The wilderness itself seemed darker after the Graysons. Every rustling tree sounded like footsteps. Every stranger's smile carried the weight of potential betrayal. And families who'd once believed faith was armor now realized it could become a blade turned against them. But perhaps the most haunting legacy is how the Graysons rewrote the American pioneer myth. Where once the Oregon Trail symbolized hope and new beginnings, it now bore the stain of unseen predators. Travelers who dreamed of golden valleys and rich farmland instead carried a new nightmare. Not everyone offering you salvation wants to save you. "We left Missouri fearing storms and sickness," one old pioneer said. "We should have feared the man who prayed beside us." And that's why the Graysons remain etched into America's darkest history. Because they didn't merely kill families. They taught an entire generation that faith, the very thing meant to save you, could become the sharpest weapon aimed at your heart. If this lingering dread chills your bones, smash that like button, subscribe for more forbidden histories, and drop a comment. Could you still trust a man of God after knowing what hid behind the chapel walls? Because on the Oregon Trail, sometimes the gravest danger was not the wilderness but the preacher leading the prayer. Some horrors don't end with the last victim they live on and the way people learn to look over their shoulders. Even decades after the Sacred Heart Chapel was torn down, the Grayson name still cast a long, black shadow across the Oregon Trail. Because what they destroyed was bigger than any single family. They shattered the very idea that goodness could be trusted. By the 1860s, stories of the Graysons had twisted into legend, passed from one wagon train to the next like dark gospel. Pioneers whispered of the chapel where prayers were poison and salvation was a death sentence. Campfires glowed in trembling circles, as old men told of Father Marai's gray eyes watching families like livestock ready for slaughter. But the true horror lay not in the tales themselves. It lay in how the Graysons changed the way people lived. Faith, once the trail's strongest armor, had become a double-edged sword. Churches across Oregon reported empty pews as settlers refused to gather where poison might be passed from one communion cup to another. Travelers refused to accept water, bread, or shelter from any stranger no matter how desperate their situation, and preachers found themselves eyed with suspicion, their every word dissected for hidden threats. "We used to believe a preacher's word was gospel truth," one old pioneer woman said. "Now we wonder if he's checking the weight of our gold." The commercial impact was catastrophic. Trading posts attached to missions saw business vanish almost overnight. The presence of a cross above the door became a warning sign instead of a welcome. Merchants who'd partnered with missionaries to sell goods were left with stockpiles rotting in storage. Some abandoned their businesses entirely, unable to endure the fear that trailed them like a phantom. Yet the psychological scars cut even deeper. Survivors like Catherine Patterson found themselves stalked not by the Graysons, but by memories they couldn't silence. She spent her final years moving from town to town, always certain that another false preacher might appear with the same soft voice and lethal intentions. "I don't go to churches," she confessed in an interview years later, "because I can't stand to see a man in a black coat stand over me and talk about God." Timothy Patterson, the boy who had once survived Sister Constance's poison, grew into a man who avoided all human closeness. He lived alone on the fringes of settlements, known as the guide who refused to pray before starting any journey. "Faith is a loaded gun," he'd tell the settlers who tried to thank him. "Be careful who you hand it to." Lawmakers tried to bring order to the chaos left in the Graysons' wake. Oregon passed laws requiring official licenses for missionary work and background checks for clergy traveling the trail. Forts established permanent patrols along vulnerable stretches of the route. But fear is not so easily legislated away. Because while the physical threat of the Graysons ended at the gallows and prison bars, the true poison remained the knowledge that trust itself could be fatal. Even years later, settlers crossing the Blue Mountains would swear they heard hymns carried on the wind. Some claimed to see pale figures moving between the trees, as if Father Marai and Sister Constance were still hunting lost souls. Parents warned their children, "If someone offers you holy medicine, don't drink it." "The wilderness didn't kill us," one old man said. "It was the evil we let inside our circle." This is why the Graysons remain burned into America's darkest history. Because their legacy wasn't just death. It was the terror that sometimes the greatest monsters prey beside you. If this haunting truth chills you as it has generations before, smash that like button, subscribe for more hidden chapters of America's past, and tell me in the comments, would you have trusted the preacher's gentle hands or fled into the wilderness, knowing that salvation might be the sharpest blade of all? Because on the Oregon Trail, sometimes the echoes of murder linger longer than any grave. History doesn't just record evil. It keeps it alive in the spaces between our breaths. Even long after the last Grayson faced justice, the very name Sacred Heart Chapel still provoked shudders across the Oregon frontier. Because the Graysons left behind more than unmarked graves and stolen possessions. They left a fracture in the American soul. In towns from Missouri to the Pacific Coast, campfire tales of Father Marai and Sister Constance morphed into folklore so potent that parents used them as cautionary threats for disobedient children. "Behave," they'd warn, "or the preacher with the gray eyes will come for you." But these weren't just ghost stories. They were psychological barbed wire, wrapping generations in invisible fear. Because the true horror was knowing that the people who'd smiled so kindly, who'd prayed over the dying and baptized newborns, were also the architects of mass murder. Churches found themselves half empty, the echo of sermons bouncing off vacant pews. Settlers who'd once believed faith was the ultimate shield now saw it as a weapon that could be turned on them, even decades later, Reports circulated of settlers avoiding chapels, preferring to pray under the open sky rather than risk being poisoned in a pew. The Grayson case also left a mark on American law. Authorities introduced new rules demanding credentials for itinerant preachers and required trading posts to keep meticulous logs of passing families. But no regulation could erase the chill that lingered every time a stranger offered a cup of tea in God's name. "We thought we'd tamed the wilderness," one old pioneer said. Turns out, the wildest place was the human heart. This is why the Graysons' legacy still lingers in America's darkest history. Because their evil didn't die with them, it crawled into our collective memory, waiting to whisper again the next time someone says, "Trust me, I'm here to save you." If this chilling aftermath haunts your thoughts, hit like, subscribe for more hidden horrors. And tell me in the comments, could you ever kneel in a chapel again? Or would you always wonder whose hands are mixing the communion wine? Because on the Oregon Trail, the real ghosts were the living ones who wore the cross. The true test of faith isn't who you trust, it's knowing when not to. The story of the Graysons reminds us that darkness doesn't always come with fangs and claws. Sometimes, it comes cloaked in scripture, speaking softly about salvation while silently planning your burial. But here's the truth: you need to hold on to evil hides. But so does courage. Yes, the Graysons shattered trust on the Oregon Trail. Yes, they twisted faith into a weapon. But in the end, it was one woman's courage, Catherine Patterson, that dragged the truth into daylight. One voice can shatter the silence that monsters count on. So if this story leaves you shaken, remember this. Your instincts are never your enemy. Your questions are your shield. And sometimes, survival means daring to say, "No, I don't believe you." History is full of horrors, but it's also full of people who refuse to stay silent. Like Catherine, like Timothy, like countless unnamed pioneers who found the strength to walk away from danger, even when it wore a holy face. And that's why stories like this matter. Because the next time someone offers you comfort with one hand while hiding the other behind their back, you'll know how to look closer. And you'll remember that faith is strongest when it's paired with vigilance. If this tale made you feel something or made you question everything, drop a comment right now and tell me, could you have spotted the Graysons for what they were? Or would you have bowed your head and prayed with them? Hit that like button if you want more hidden chapters of America's darkest history. Save this video so you can share these truths with someone else. And smash that subscribe button so you never miss the stories they tried to bury. Because sometimes, knowing the darkness is how we keep the light alive.